we'll go ahead and get started, and we'll just let people join as they will, if that's okay.
Sounds good.
So once again, we're here with Dr. Barbara Gastel. She is going to be leading a webinar on being an excellent peer reviewer. Dr. Gastel is a professor of veterinary integrative biosciences and of humanities in medicine here at Texas A&M University. She received her BA from Yale and her MD and MPH from Johns Hopkins. She's a physician who specializes in writing and editing, and again is a professor at the College of Vet Med and at the College of Medicine. She's also the coordinator of the master's degree program in science and technology journalism at the College of Vet Med. And please welcome Dr. Barbara Gastel.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here today. So today we're going to be talking about being an excellent peer reviewer. And as before, I thought I'd provide some scenic slides to provide sort of a break from all the text. And I should ask, have any of you been to Iguazu Falls, Brazil? Really a beautiful, beautiful area. And I thought that particularly today, you know, since it's such a hot day and I think a lot of us are sheltering in place because so it'd be nice to have a view of someplace that is sort of cool and scenic. So today we'll talk about several things, sort of a review of what is peer review, why be a peer reviewer, how to become a peer reviewer and what it entails. And then the real focus is how you can be an excellent peer reviewer. And the main focus will be on peer reviewing journal manuscripts, but a lot of what we say will also apply to other peer reviewing. I'll mention a few resources, and then at the end, there'll be questions and answers. And I have provided Stacy with a copy of the slides, and you will receive them afterwards. And Stacy, is this being recorded too?
Yes, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that. Yes, we are recording. I will send everyone an email afterwards. If you registered, I'll send you an email. If you didn't register, let me know and I will include you in that email, but I won't have your information. So just email me and let me know that you want that. So I'll provide the presentation slides, Dr. Gastel's email address, so you can ask her questions afterwards if you think of anything afterwards. And then yes, the video recording will be posted on my YouTube channel. I also want to mention that we had about 40 people registered today. And so we are going to take questions in the chat that I will relay to Dr. Gastel. Although she'll probably pause like she did last time here and there to see if there are any questions. So just put them in the chat as you think of them and we will get to them.
Thank you very much. And in fact, we will have use for a chat in just a moment because I thought we'd have some introductions sort of to map things out. Here's the map of the park where the falls are. And so first of all, I thought I should introduce myself. As Stacy mentioned, I'm a professor both at the vet school and the medical school, and coordinate the master's degree program in science and technology journalism. So come to this from both a medical and scientific standpoint and a communications standpoint. And my experience with peer reviewing, one is as a peer reviewer over the years, I've peer reviewed quite a few journal manuscripts and some other items, including book manuscripts, book proposals, research proposals, proposals for presentations. So have done some peer reviewing myself. I've been on the other side as an author receiving peer reviews and both sometimes feeling the sting of the criticism, but mainly benefiting from good suggestions from peer reviewers. and also I have been an editor of a small journal. And so I would sometimes be requesting peer reviews and using them. So see it from the editor's side too. And also I'm active in the Council of Science Editors. And so hear a lot in that regard. And so how about you? Maybe you can use the chat, and maybe let Stacy know. Maybe Stacy, you can summarize. Maybe if you have been a peer reviewer, maybe you can type yes, something like that in the chat. Stacy, are we getting some responses? It looks like we do.
Yes, I was reading one. Let's see. We've got one that says yes, peer reviewed for 2 conferences, and then one person has said yes, several papers.
Oh, okay, good. So we do have some people who've been peer reviewers. How about being on the other side? How many people have had journal articles peer reviewed?
We have one, I've had articles peer reviewed. Yes, have 19 publications out there. Yes.
Wow.
Yes, I've written about 12 articles and a book chapter. I've had 2 articles peer reviewed. So it looks like both yes. sides here.
Okay, so we've had some experience on both sides. Good. And I think we've already answered that other work of yours been peer reviewed. And so I'd really like to make this interactive. It looks like people have had a range of experience, but some of you, it sounds like you have a fair amount of experience with peer reviewing. So hope you will share your thoughts, and I hope everybody will share questions. Really like this to be interactive. And as mentioned, I will periodically pause for questions. And so please be typing your questions, and Stacy will keep track of them. And then at the end, we'll have the open question and answer session. So another view of the falls. And I think all of us know what peer review is, but I just thought helpful to start with the definition. And so basically, peer review is evaluation of scientific communication by fellow experts in the subject area. So it's evaluation saying, what the strengths and weaknesses are. We mentioned scientific communication. It could be a paper or presentation or a grant proposal. And the peers, other people who are experts in the subject area. And as we mentioned, variety of things can be reviewed. And I put scientific papers in boldface because that's probably what most of us do most of the reviewing of. And then thinking about, the purposes of the review, why are we doing it? It's a fair amount of work. One that I think comes to mind right away is to help in making decisions. For example, helping the editors of a journal decide whether they're going to publish a paper, or let's say helping NIH or another funding agency decide whether to fund proposed research. But I think another, at least equally important one, is to help researchers improve their work, because often the feedback provided by peer review will result in improving a paper or improving a research project or improving a presentation. And I think in doing a really excellent peer review, keep both of those in mind, both making an overall recommendation, but very importantly, providing constructive feedback. And those of you who come from an education background, maybe used to using the terms summative and formative evaluation. In other words, summative evaluation, making an overall decision on, does this pass or not, or how good is it? But then formative evaluation, in other words, providing feedback that will improve the item. And so I guess one of the questions is why be a peer reviewer? I mean, doing a good peer review is an investment of time, could be doing something else. So why spend the time? I think the big one and the main one is its service to the field, that if you're part of the scientific community, other people will be reviewing your work, and in return, you're expected to review other people's work. And so it's an important service. It also can be really good practice in critical thinking. And it can be, I find, a chance to broaden one's learning. I mean, I sometimes am asked to peer review things that are, I mean, in my field, but maybe are including, you know, for example, some literature that I wasn't aware of, and I'll find out new things. So it's a learning experience. I find it's a source of insights for improving my own writing. I will see, for example, problems with other people's writing, and then I realize, oh, I do that. I shouldn't be doing that. Or I'll see, you know, someone presenting something in a really good way, and I think, yeah, never thought of using a graph for that. You know, that's a good idea. It's also a chance to build your curriculum vitae. It's, I think, considered pretty standard on an academic CV to list the journals you're a peer reviewer for. And that's something that is taken into account, for example, if you're being considered for promotion. If you're interested in eventually becoming an editorial board member, or maybe an associate editor or editor at a journal, the way to start is by peer reviewing, because often in identifying editorial board members, the editors will notice who has done really good peer reviews and invite them to be editorial board members. And then the more active editorial board members can become editors. Sometimes there are also perks, not always. In some cases, for example, journal access. Let's say it's not an open access journal. Sometimes if you're a peer reviewer, they will give you access to the journal for a given amount of time. In medicine, some journals will actually provide continuing education credit for doing excellent peer reviews. For some kind of peer reviewing, there's a little bit of payment. An example is reviewing a book manuscript, which can take a lot of time and a lot of work. Often one can, you know, the publisher will either pay a couple $100, or what they'll do is give a choice of either some payment or some books. And so there can be a variety of perks. Some journals will once a year list all the people who've been peer reviewers. Some associations, conferences have receptions for their peer reviewers at their conferences. And there may be other advantages also of being a peer reviewer. And in fact, let me pause here now and see if there are any questions or anything people would like to add to this list of reasons to be a peer reviewer.
I don't see any questions yet. Anybody have anything?
If not, I will move on, and feel free to have questions at any time. I know sometimes, particularly some people earlier in the field will be asking, well, how do you become a peer reviewer? The main way is becoming known through your publications and presentations. Editors keep track of the literature. And so, for example, if you've had some papers published in a journal, the editors are aware of you and may call on you. Or even at another journal, they may see that you've been cited in a paper, or they may do a literature search on a topic. And so if they're aware of your publications, if editors have seen you present at conferences. So once you get known in the field, likely to get invitations. Another way is being suggested by someone who declines an invitation to review. So as probably you know, the journal will contact you if there's a paper that they think you might be a good match, but sometimes someone will decline the invitation. And when you're declining an invitation, you're asked, if possible, to suggest some other possible reviewers. So maybe someone's too busy, or they realize they don't have exactly the expertise, so they might suggest you, and then the journal might contact you. Another possibility is being suggested by someone who'd like you to collaborate on a review. Let's say your PI or someone else maybe is asked to review, and they feel that it would be helpful to have you collaborate. They may feel that it would be a good learning experience. And in that case, what they should do is ask the journal for permission and let them know that you'd be reviewing as well, because peer reviewing is confidential, and so one isn't supposed to just say, hey, help me with this, need permission, but that's a really good way to get involved in reviewing. And another one that sometimes people may not realize is volunteering. Editors are always looking for peer reviewers, and in recent years, and I'm not sure reason why, it seems it's been getting harder and harder to get peer reviewers. And I know in talking with journal editors, they might say, well, it used to be for every one person who agreed, let's say I had to ask 2 people, but now maybe it's 3 or 4 or 5 people. And so they're really looking for peer reviewers. I've noticed some journals' websites even have a place where you can volunteer to be in their pool of peer reviewers, and they would, often there's a form you'd fill out about your interests and expertise. Or even if the journal's website doesn't have something like that, really doesn't hurt to send the editor an email message, say what your background is, and say you'd be willing to do some peer reviews if occasion arises. And I think sometimes people are hesitant. They think, well, I don't know enough, or it's immodest or whatever. But again, I think you're doing a service, and then the editor can decide whether to call on you. But it's a good way to get involved. So let me check. Are there any questions about becoming a peer reviewer? See, haven't heard anything in that regard, so let me move on. And what being a peer reviewer entails, this may be review for most people, but there were a few points I thought should emphasize, even if people may already know them. Obviously, being a peer reviewer entails carefully evaluating the item. And that means identifying both strengths and areas for potential improvement. I think it's really easy to just zero in on what's wrong, but it's important to identify both. And the other thing that I think I want to emphasize, because I think it counters a myth, in peer reviewing, people should mainly focus on content, on the scientific quality of the content, not on the presentation. I think sometimes people confuse peer reviewing and editing and think I have to, let's say, correct all the grammar errors, things like that. They're not looking for that. If something is accepted, then there are normally editors, the journal, that can deal with the grammar errors, or there are other ways to deal with it. So they're not really looking for you to edit things, but evaluate the content and the overall quality of the writing. And then, of course, would need to be reporting to the editor or the funding agency or whatever. And that normally there are instructions to follow. Often there are forms to fill out, which makes it sometimes easier. And I think in preparing the report, important to strive for balance, and also to be clear. And another thing is sometimes helpful to remember who's likely to read what parts, particularly for a journal. There are likely to be two parts. There are confidential comments to the editor, and then there are comments to the author, which both the editor and the authors read. And I think being somewhat careful, because there are some things that could be appropriate to say to the editor that would not be appropriate to say to the author, and we'll have some examples of those in a little while. So let me pause again. Any additional comments, questions, or additions?
We do have a couple of questions. We have one: how advanced do you need to be in your career before you start seeking opportunities to be a peer reviewer?
Good question. How advanced do you need to be before you start to seek opportunities? I would think, sort of basically once you start publishing, I would say late graduate school, early postdoc, and normally for a journal article, there are a number of peer reviewers, usually at least 2 or 3 or 4. And what the editor may do is try to pair you with more advanced peer reviewers. So let's say one of the peer reviewers is a beginning postdoc who's published 4 papers or something like that. Probably they wouldn't want, to have 3 people like that peer reviewing, but they might, have a couple more senior people on postdocs. So I think once you start publishing, doesn't hurt to start volunteering. And often journals like to have, some fairly junior reviewers who will be people in the pipeline.
Okay, we've got one more. Similar to impact factor for publication of your own article, does the impact factor matter for the journal you are peer reviewing for?
Oh, that's a good question. So, does impact factor matter? Let me phrase this a little more broadly. I would say, what does the prominence or the prestige of the journal matter? Because impact factor is loosely correlated, but not really totally correlated. I would say it matters, somewhat. And I think for getting, experience, almost any legitimate journal is good. But I think in building your CV, places like to see that you've been peer reviewing for some of the top journals in your field, the top and mid-rank journals in your field. So let's say you do get to the point where you're getting a lot of invitations to peer review, you're trying to decide on your time, then one factor would be the prominence of the journal. Yeah, great. Great question. Any other questions before we move on?
That's all I see here.
Okay, good. So, and so why don't we move to what you might be asked about? And sort of a basic question is that a journal would be asking is, does the work seem to be new, true, and important? And so again, boldface, they're looking for your evaluation of the scientific quality of the content. Also, the importance. Does this research answer an important question or not? Another thing is novelty and originality. Is this something that really breaks new ground? Is a new approach, something that's really new? Or is it more just sort of a Me Too paper that just sort of fills in some gaps? Timeliness, is this something that, is of current interest, current importance? Potential interest to readers. The journal would be asking, well, is this paper for our journal? Because, for example, I recently reviewed a paper that was submitted to a clinical journal, and I think it was probably an okay paper, but it wasn't, my feeling was that this would not be of much interest to clinicians and that it would probably be better off in a different journal. The overall quality of the writing is a consideration, overall quality of the tables and figures, and maybe ask about some other things, but I think these are some of the core things the journal would ask you about. And in some cases, I find they'll have a checklist or a Likert scale or something for such items. And then what occurs once a journal receives your peer review, I suspect most people are fairly familiar with this, but let me quickly run through this. The journal editor would then consider various factors in deciding whether to accept the paper. So they consider your peer review, they consider other peer reviews, one or more editors at the journal would have read the paper, they'd have their reviews, and then other factors. For example, the scope of the journal. Does this really fit in with the subject matter? Especially if it's a print journal or if it's an electronic journal that has some type of quota. Is there enough, how much space in the journal is there? And sometimes also even the desired balance of papers, that often a journal will want papers in various aspects of its subject area. So if they already have a lot of papers that are really good on the subject, they may be stricter than, for example, if it's a subject area that they're really wanting more submissions in and haven't gotten any. So they'll consider lots of factors. And of course, the editors can then decide whether to accept the paper as is, which is almost never, accept if revised, reconsider if revised, or reject. Something that I like, some journals will send the peer reviewers copies of the decision letter and some parts of the other peer reviewers' reviews, for example, the comments for the author. And I really like to review for journals that do that. It's satisfying to see the loop closed. And I find that I really learn a lot by reading the other reviewers' reviews, seeing what points we agree on, which we disagree on, things they caught that I missed, or vice versa. And especially if something's sort of a complex or multidisciplinary paper, the journal may be choosing different reviewers for different expertise. And so I can learn from the other reviewers' expertise. And then you may have a re-review of the revised manuscript. Some journals or for some types of paper, when a revised manuscript comes back, the manuscript may be sent to one or more of the reviewers again to look over. And so now we have some people in the view, and we'll move on to so the people part. How can you be an excellent peer reviewer? And Stacy, any more questions at this point?
Yes, we have a couple. We have one. I struggle with the importance and novelty because those seem to depend on the journal. Is that my job as a reviewer to assess, or is that the job of an editor?
Yeah, that's a great question. Struggling with importance and novelty. Is it your job as a reviewer or of the editor? And I'd say it's sort of both. It's sort of your job as a reviewer to give your take on the novelty and importance, your view, and ideally your reasons for that. And then that can help inform the editor's decision, because the editor may be thinking, wow, I hadn't noticed that it was novel in this regard. Or, I thought it was novel. I hadn't been aware of this other paper. So I think it's sort of the job of both. It's sort of a collaborative task.
Okay, we have one more. What are the different ways to get acceptance rate for journals and conferences if it's not available on the website?
Right, if the acceptance rate, for journals or conference, I would just say to contact the editorial office. There's usually an email address for the editor or managing editor, and if the website doesn't list them, I would just contact. So I've divided excellence into sort of 4 parts of being an excellent reviewer. And I think being an excellent reviewer starts with deciding what invitations to accept. And one of the first questions was, does the manuscript seem well matched with your expertise? Because sometimes a journal will send something and it really isn't too well matched. And in that case, it's better to suggest someone else, or to at least let the journal know limitations. There have been times I've been asked and I've been able to say, well, I'm able to address, such and such aspects, but I am not familiar with, let's say a certain method, is that okay? And often they'll say, well, yes, we have other reviewers who are interested in that aspect where, we were looking for something for you. Or the most extreme in that regard was, I remember getting one manuscript that I thought was interesting, but it was really a bit outside my area. And so I replied to the journal and said I thought it was outside my area. And they said, in that case, they said they wanted to have a generalist. They said they had gotten several specialists, but wanted, someone who'd provide sort of a thoughtful general physician's view of it. But I think worthwhile considering, is this a good match or is it really better to go to someone else? Another thing is, do you have enough time to do a thorough review by the deadline? It's not right to keep the journal waiting. And I think those of us who've been on the other side waiting for peer reviews, as authors, so do you really have enough time, or are you so busy that it's better to pass this one on? And I should mention also, sometimes one thinks one has enough time but ends up in a time crunch. And in that case, let the journal know. I mean, I think I'm usually pretty strict about getting my reviews in on time, although a lot of times it's the last day that I get them in. But once recently, this was just the spring with COVID-19 and things changing rapidly at the university and suddenly having to scramble to give my courses online, I realized that there was a review due, I think, on a Thursday, and that I really couldn't do a good job. And so I contacted the journal and I said, can I have till next Monday? They said it was fine. So, but considering time constraints. Another thing is, are you free of conflicts of interest? Is this something that you can you can fairly and balanced and do an unbiased review, or do you have a conflict of interest? For example, is this your former student, or your friend or your lab mate? Is it someone you've collaborated with? Is it about a product from a company that you have stock in? Are there any kinds of personal or financial conflicts of interest? And if you do have any conflicts, need to let the journal know, and then they can decide, is this a severe enough conflict that you should not be reviewing, or is it something that they should take into account, but that it's not a significant conflict of interest? And do you have any other concerns that that maybe would compromise your ability to do a good review? And one thing, if you decline an invitation to review, a couple of things is, one, try to decline it promptly so they can find someone else. And also, if you can, try to suggest other potential reviewers. That can be really, really helpful. It helps speed things along. So let me check any additional questions at this point.
Yes, we have one. Peer reviewer deadlines probably vary from journal to journal. Can you give some examples of review deadlines you've seen?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, I was debating that. I usually, the journals that I review for usually give me 2 or 3 weeks to do a review. Some journals it'll be like a month or so. Some journals will fast track certain papers. For example, right now with COVID-19, clearly there are some journals fast tracking papers and wanting a review, you know, in a day or 2 or 3 or less than a week. So if something's, let's say, of public health importance or really, you know, very hot research, it may be, you know, just short expedited review. And then there's some journals that have really long review times. The longest I think I have ever had for a journal, there was one journal that gave me 3 months. And this was a history of science journal. And I guess, you know, sort of as historians, they probably figured this was something historical. No one's life is depending on it. It was sort of a humanities pace. So I had 3 months to do that review. But usually for me, I get 2 or 3 weeks. And actually, if people have experience, we could do a mini survey now, and you could type in chat how long you've been given for reviews.
We have one more question. I'm going to try to summarize this question. I think what they're asking is it the purview of the reviewer to judge the English grammar
Right.
of the writer?
Right, good question. Is it the purview of the reviewer? I would say it's the purview to make general comments, you know, overall, but not to go, certainly not to make disparaging comments about the grammar, rude comments, or it's not the role of the reviewer to go through and correct all the grammar. But I would say if, you know, there are a lot of problems with grammar, you know, a simple statement like saying there are, you know, many problems with the grammar, you know, I suggest editing in this regard, something like that.
Okay, and then looks like we've gotten some responses from some other folks on the other question. It looks like we've gotten 3 to 4 weeks, 2 weeks to 15 days. Typically, I've been given 2 weeks to a month is what we've got.
Okay, yeah, so it sounds like just, you know, the same range that I've had experience with usually. You know, if it's not really an expedited review or for a humanities journal, it's usually in the, you know, 2 to 4 week range. And so that's part of excellence. Excellence too is adhering to ethical standards. And we talked about avoiding conflicts of interest, which sometimes is tough if it's a very small field and everybody knows each other. And I think in those fields, particularly, I mean, just knowing somebody isn't a conflict of interest. Let's say, you know, somebody you see at conferences and things. But, you know, if you have a vested interest in their success, then it would be. Well, yes, that's right. Already the responding promptly mentioned avoiding conflicts, avoiding bias. I think sometimes, let's say, sometimes you'll get a paper, and some papers they will be blinded by the name of the author and the institution, others not. But sometimes, you know, there can be a tendency to be biased if you think, oh, wow, this comes from a great institution. It must be a great paper, or, you know, there's, you know, something else about the paper that might bias you against it. So trying to just look at what's there and not be biased about, you know, other things. I think a big thing about the ethics is maintaining confidentiality, that the paper is confidential and not supposed to discuss, the content with anybody. You're not supposed to discuss the quality of the writing with anybody. It is confidential. Another thing is not taking advantage of insider information. I mean, let's say there may be, let's say if it's with regard to a pharmaceutical, there may be information that would influence stock prices, things like that. But as a peer reviewer, you cannot use that information until it becomes public. Or same thing, taking advantage of insider information to get ahead on your research. I mean, if someone lists a reference and you want to look up that reference, yeah, that's great, because that's public knowledge, but not taking advantage of insider information. And avoiding undue delays, because it's not fair to the journal, not fair to the author to sit on something. So those were some aspects of keeping to ethical standards. Have there been additional questions now?
I don't see any additional questions right now.
So let's get to really the core of review, providing appropriate content in the review. To me, this requires reading the item more than once. I find I have to often read it once just to get the big picture and then go through it at least one more time carefully. And then, as we talked about, focusing mainly on the scientific quality, not the writing style. Although particularly if the writing style is so bad that it interferes with understanding, I think that's important to comment on. Maybe clarification is needed. I think something else that's important is both evaluating what's there and then sometimes the harder thing, which is noting omissions. You know, what isn't there that should be? Noting ambiguities. You know, where do things need clarification, if there are any places like that? I think it's also important, if the reasons for recommendations aren't obvious, to give reasons for them. Also, avoiding going off on tangents. I find occasionally there are reviewers that just have, you know, sort of a pet topic, and they'll put something on the pet topic and it's not really relevant. Or I find sometimes when people review book manuscripts, they're not really reviewing the book that's there. They're reviewing the book sort of they wish had been written, which, you know, it doesn't make sense. And usually, at least most of the journals I've worked with, the reviewers are anonymous, and so the authors, and also the final decision is, you know, don't know, you know, who, you know, sort of said what for the final decision. And so there's the section for authors generally shouldn't say whether you recommend acceptance, because as we saw, there are many factors that go into the decision, and maybe you don't think it should be published, but you know, there are overriding reasons on the journal part, or maybe you think it should be published, but you know, other reviewers have identified problems, or it's not high priority. So it's a problem if you say whether it should be published in just the comments for the authors. Any other comments at this point before we go to Excellence 4?
I don't see any additional questions right now.
And then I think with regard to reviewing the content, something helpful to consider certain questions almost in the order of the paper. So considering, does the introduction provide appropriate context, which might vary depending on the audience of the journal. Does the introduction clearly identify the purpose of the research? And in some cases, this may be a hypothesis, a research question. Is the purpose important? Are the methods appropriate? Are the methods sound? Is there enough information on the results? Or does it seem they've left some things out? Are the results plausible from what you know of, you know, research in the field and what the methods can provide. Does the discussion answer the question asked? Sometimes I find, the introduction will pose what the research question was, but the discussion never really addresses that. If there are anomalies, are they addressed? Are the results placed in enough context with other research? Does the discussion address limitations and explore the implications and applications of the findings? And importantly, are the conclusions supported by the findings, or, as I'll often see, the authors have sort of overinterpreted things? Overall, is the paper well written? If not, what kinds of improvements are needed? Are the tables and figures well designed? If not, what types of improvements are needed? Are appropriate references cited? I like to read the abstract first, but then after reviewing the paper in detail, then go back and really evaluate the abstract, because sometimes I'm not sure about the abstract till I'm really familiar with the content. And then I can ask, does it accurately summarize the content? And does the title accurately represent the content? I find it can be helpful for a peer reviewer if a title is confusing or misleading, to suggest a different title. And just more broadly, any other concerns or suggestions. And then presenting the content appropriately, so you may know what you want to say. I think a big part is remembering that there's an author there who has feelings. There's a human being out there who probably worked really hard on the research, worked really hard on the paper. The work is dear to their heart. Remember, this is a person who has feelings. So even if you have some, fairly strong criticisms, word them tactfully. Another thing that's helpful is organizing the review well. Often the structure's specified, so you don't have to do that, but if it's open-ended, what's usually helpful is to provide some general comments on sort of the strengths and limitations, and then line by line feedback or paragraph by paragraph feedback. And I like to begin and end positively, sort of show in the comments for the author, show the author that I'm sort of on their side, and that I'm just not only noticing the problem. So I'll begin by, saying appreciate the chance to review this, and then note, at least one thing that I thought was a strength. And then usually say, however, I feel it still could be improved, and then list things. And then at the end, say again that I appreciated the chance, and, wishing you much success in your continuing work, something like that. So organizing it well, wording the comments clearly, concisely, don't ramble on, and wording things tactfully. And I find sometimes I have to go back and I'll revise things to make them, more tactful. Another thing is providing constructive, specific suggestions for how people can improve things. Rather than, for example, saying, well, this part was badly organized. That's not very helpful. It would be more helpful to say, I think the organization of this part could be improved. Consider, saying, doing this and this and this. Or rather than saying, well, this is unclear, you may be able to say, well, did you mean this or this? So giving some specific instructions, or rather than just saying, this part's too detailed, saying what details you think could be deleted. If appropriate, helping to teach the author. Sometimes I'll get papers that clearly are by someone very early in the field, or maybe someone who's from a part of the world where instruction in scientific writing is not available. And so for those people, I will put in more explanation of my comments, and I might list some resources they can use. And this was the point that I was sort of veering off on before. In general, avoiding disclosing your identity. Some journals, they do have open peer review where they list the peer reviewers, or they'll give you the choice. But a lot of journals, you shouldn't disclose your identity, and so you shouldn't sign the review, or in those cases, even say things that would disclose your identity. You know, like, you know, for this, why don't you see my paper on such and such? So before we go on to mention some resources, we have a little time for questions. Do we have more questions at this point?
Yes, we have a couple. Is there ever a point where the quality of paper is so bad that as a reviewer you decide it's not worth reviewing the paper in detail and give general comments instead?
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, some papers are so bad it's not a good use of your time. Some journals will screen, you know, try to screen those out ahead of time. You know, some journals have initial screening, and if they see a paper is just really, really bad, they'll, you know, sort of do a desk reject with, you know, without peer review. But some get through, and some journals do something. So I think in that case, there are either of a couple of things to do, because it's not worth spending many hours on a paper that, you know, really can't be salvaged. One possibility is, without even doing the review, contacting the editor saying, I've taken an initial look at this paper and, you know, I see that it has some fatal flaws. Would you like me to proceed with the review, or should I just return it to you? Or the other thing is, just as said, if, you know, if there are problems that are just the kiss of death, you know, then just a brief review. You know, this is a, you know, a randomized controlled trial, and there's no control group. You know, if there's, you know, something that's really bad, then I think just a brief, polite, you know, review, pointing out the major points. It's not worth going on for 3 pages if there are fatal flaws. Thank you. Yes, other questions there?
I have one. What if the writer should have referenced your paper?
Right, if the writer should have referenced the paper, I'd say the same thing is for anybody else's paper. Treat your papers like everybody else's. And so, you know, then don't say you should have referenced my paper, that gives it away, but perhaps you just say, there should be a reference here to, you know, Gastel and Days, you know, such and such, just, you know, matter of fact. And here's a place, again, where it's, I think, important to be objective and fair. There are some reviewers who, unfortunately, will request, you know, that their papers be referenced, even if they're not relevant, and obviously you shouldn't do that. But if your papers are relevant and they're left out, then, you know, it's being objective to suggest that they be referenced. And sometimes it's funny, I remember one paper that referenced one of my papers, but then, you know, got my name wrong and had some other errors, and some sort of undermined the credibility of that author.
Okay, we have one more. This one's kind of long. Well, it looks like it's got a couple of questions within it. I have reviewed a technique that I thought was great and novel, but was not published in the end because of other issues with the manuscript. What is the best way to move forward on this? Is this the best practice to contact the authors and see about collaboration, which removes anonymity, or just wait for them to rework their work and publish it, which may never happen? Additionally, if a collaborator comes up with the same technique, at what point is it okay to take part in using this technique? And then one last question from the same person. How do you feel about Publon's tracking of peer reviews?
Right, I'll go with the last one first, because I still, I still haven't come to a conclusion about Publon's tracking of peer reviews. I think if, in terms of, you know, something that, you know, was a neat technique, and it wasn't accepted by the journal, but then as soon as, if it's accepted by another journal and published, as soon as it's published, it becomes open, and whether or not you peer review it, you can use it. The question of whether you can then contact the author, let's say it's not been peer reviewed, but you're aware of it, that is that's a really tricky one. That's really interesting. I think I would contact the editor of the journal for advice on how to proceed. Also, I might try to figure out whether the person had presented this at any meetings, because let's say if conference programs are available, and if they've presented it at meetings or things like that, then it would be open, maybe able to. But yeah, that would be a good case to pose to some experts in the field. Let me mention some resources. Book How to Write and Publish a Scientific Paper, which is available online through our library, has a chapter on how to provide peer review. If you're interested in sort of the ethical aspect, Council of Science Editors has something I've provided a link to. Some of you may have seen in Science in Working Life, there was a nice piece called Reviewers Don't Be Rude to Non-Native English Speakers that made the point that you're not there to review the English or make disparaging comments on it, and had some good points. And I think one of the points and ones that I've made also is don't just say have this reviewed by a native speaker. As often, that's not very helpful, and a lot of native speakers aren't capable of doing that. And there are a lot of non-native English speakers who are very capable of improving people's English. So much more appropriate, if you think it should be reviewed by experts, have it, ask that it be reviewed by someone with full English proficiency. I want to mention there's actually a conference on peer review that's held every few years, and I have a link to the website. Also every year there's Peer Review Week, and I have a link to that. And amazingly, yesterday, Nature had an editorial called Communication is Key to Constructive Peer Review. And this was, they had actually surveyed some reviewers and authors and editors, I guess, and gotten their comments on what they thought was most helpful, if their main suggestion. And here's a quote from it that I thought was a good for closing or near closing thought. One survey respondent said that it would help if everyone involved approach the publication of a paper as they would a conversation. Ideally, it would be a discussion among colleagues in which everyone was working to solve the same problem. And I thought that was a really good concept, because really, I think if one approaches peer reviewing as a collaboration, it's really you're collaborating with the author and the editor to help serve everybody, and especially to help serve the reader. I think that is a productive, constructive approach. So I think officially our time is about up. If we still have some questions and comments, I would be glad to stay on longer.
We have one that's similar to the last question that was asked. It is, if you can improve their work and it never gets published, how long should you wait to see if they publish that work elsewhere or proceed on your own to improve their work?
Right, yeah, so if it's improved or never published elsewhere, because then I guess can't really follow up on it. And I guess one can have the satisfaction of knowing that perhaps you, with luck, they've learned some things that will be helpful. You may want to try to follow some of their other publications, but there is, sometimes there is is work that doesn't get published. I think particularly, yeah, and one can hope one has done a service both to the author by helping them learn some things and perhaps some quality control with the literature. Any other questions or comments?
Looks like that's all we have right now. Does anybody have any other questions? Oh, here we go. This is from the same person. How to balance giving credit for unpublished work versus being in research competition.
Yeah, that I'm not sure I totally follow that, but in terms of I guess in terms of citation, normally one would only cite published work, though one might, in parentheses, talk about a personal communication, but one would need permission for that.
Okay, well, it is after 12, and it looks like we don't have any other questions. We have some thank yous.
Well, I want to thank you all for your participation, and thank you for all the good questions. And if you have further questions or comments or anything, you'll have my email address, and feel free to contact me. So all the best to you.
And thank you, Dr. Gastel. We appreciate this 2 webinars in a row from you. Your expertise is invaluable. So thank you so much. Just a reminder to everybody, I will send an email out with the link to the video and the presentation slides. And I'll have Dr. Gastel's email address there so that you can ask her questions if anything else comes up. And thank you, everybody, for participating.
Yes, thank you very much. Take care.